So, Mythology Summer Reading continues. And I thought today that I would also read you a piece of my book, Iron Axe. Now, Iron Axe is the first book in a fantasy trilogy called The Books of Blood and Iron. And it was inspired actually by Norse mythology and a bit of trollish folklore. And beyond that, I don't really need to say much because we're going to start with chapter one. So here we go. Iron Axe by Stephen Harper. That's me. On sale at bookstores everywhere. Chapter 1. The stable door creaked open and threw a painful square of sunshine on the dirt floor. Donner automatically flung up his free hand to shield his eyes. His other hand wielded a manure fork. A lone cow, kept in from pasture due to an injured leg, lowed nervously and shifted in her stall. Trollboy, Norbert Alfgarson crossed heavy arms in the doorway. His patchy brown beard stuck out short and prickly, like last year's wheat stubble. Get out here. Calf fell down the new well. He left without waiting for a reply, leaving the stable door standing open, showing a large tree inexpertly carved on the outside of it. The square of morning sunlight hung there like a sharp-edged shield. Donner set the manure fork down with a grimace. He was tall enough that his head rapped the ceiling beams if he didn't take care, and his large hands bore the calluses of heavy work. His bare feet shuffled across the dirt floor, avoiding the bright square, though he was only putting off the inevitable. At the door, he lifted a battered straw hat from a peg and clapped it over wiry black hair, then screwed up his face, touched the tree, and stepped outside. Sunlight slapped him hard. A dull ache settled into the back of his wide brown eyes despite the shading brim of the straw hat, and he squinted down at the ground, unable to even give the clear spring sky a glance. His wide-set toes clenched at the bare earth of the barnyard. The stories said sunlight turned the stain to stone. Donner didn't quite believe that, but if the sun caused this much discomfort to someone whose mother was kin and whose father was Stain, he could understand why the stain supposedly hid under the mountain during the day. Over here, troll boy, Norbert called. He was the eldest son of Alfgeir Oxbreeder, the enormously successful herder of cattle and sheep who owned the farm where Donner was currently a thrall. Move! I don't want this calf to break something because you dawdle. Donner straightened his back and strode across the barnyard, away from the cool, inviting depths of the stable. Outside, the crisp, fresh air of spring rolled down the western mountains, bringing with it smells of flowers and new leaves and just a hint of snow from the heights. Alfgeir's generous herds lowed in stone-bound pastures in the distance, side by side with recently planted fields. The farm was in the lull of late spring, when calving, plowing, and planting were over, and the season's first haying had not yet begun, so there was time for other work, such as repairing thatch, reinforcing fences, and digging a new well for the cattle. Norbert was standing at the latter, hands on hips. So far, the well was nothing but a hole in the ground. A formidable pile of earth and rocks stood nearby, and Donner knew it would be his eventual job to move it. From far below came a faint bawl. Donner sidled up to the well, slumping his shoulders and hunching over out of long habit, though it did little to disguise the fact that he had a full head of height on Norbert. His shoulders were broader, his legs sturdier, and his skin swarthier than anyone else on the farm. Donner's long jaw jutted forward, giving him a pugnacious look, and his lower canines were just a little too long. He had no beard, but wiry hair was making progress over his chest and back. Although he had just turned 16, he already had a barrel chest and heavy hands with thick fingernails. He quickly outgrew the cast-offs Alfgeir's wife deigned to hand him, and his clothing was always patched and bursting at the seams. Compared to the fine wool tunics and well-cut trousers Norbert and his brother wore, Donner was a shambling rag-bag. His eyes, however, were wide and brown and liquid, and Donner's mother always said that they were his best feature, but they were always hidden under his battered hat. In any case, no one seemed to notice his eyes. They only noticed that he was that troll boy. Well, Norbert said. Donner peered down the well and was just able to make out the form of the calf at the bottom, some 15 feet down. It was up to its knees in muck. Donner glanced at the calf pen, where the young cattle were kept apart from the rest of the herd during the day so they wouldn't be injured by the larger animals, and knew what had happened. It had come to Norbert that morning to separate the calves from their mothers. He'd been careless and let one run after its mother, whereupon it had fallen into the well. It got away from the pen then? Donner asked, his voice low and quiet. Mother always said, be gentle, be soft-spoken, and people won't think you a monster. None of your business, troll boy, Norbert snapped, confirming Donner's suspicion. I should shove you down that well to join the calf and bury you with the rest of your filthy kind. The insults stabbed his gut. He'd been hearing them for 16 years, and it seemed like he should be used to them, but like the sunlight that pounded at his eyes, he never adjusted. Each one was a pinprick, or a knife cut, or a spear thrust, and some days it felt like he was bleeding to death. Other days the wounds turned his blood to lava, and he felt like he might burst out of his clothes from the anger he could never show, not even once. Thralls didn't get angry. No, they didn't. It wasn't fair or right, but when had the world been either, especially to his kind? His clothes felt tight, and he worked his jaw. I'm sorry, Norbert, Donner said, eyes down. Norbert punched him in the gut. The air burst from Donner's lungs, and white pain slammed his stomach. He staggered, gasping at the unexpected pain. Anger flashed. I'm sorry what? Norbert snapped. Donner had forgotten. Norbert had reached his majority. Donner forced himself to straighten, but not too much. Not so he was taller than Norbert. His gut ached. The monster inside him growled. He would have loved to punch back, but of course he did not. Yes, Karl Alfgeierson. What is it? What is happening now? Alfgeir Oxbreeder hurried over. He was an older version of his son, with thinning brown hair, a bushier beard, and a heavy nose. His fine leather overtunic and thick woolen breeches bespoke his success as a farmer, as did the silver buckles on his boots and at his waist. The fool let one of the new calves fall down the well, Norbert said. What's this? What's this? Alfgeir peered down the well. Troll boy, if that calf is injured or killed, I'll add more to your bonding. I, Donner began, but Norbert made another fist behind Alfgeir's back, and the words died. Norbert smirked. Anger beat a war drum inside Donner, and he ached to smash that smirk. He clutched with shaking hand at the small pouch with 2 splinters in it that he wore on a thong around his neck. Both pouch and splinters had belonged to Donner's mother, the only legacy she had left him. They expect you to be a monster, Mother said. Don't give them the satisfaction. Donner closed his eyes, trying unsuccessfully to make the anger and resentment disappear. His father was a troll, his mother a human, and for that terrible crime both he and his mother had been banished to the edges of village society. Karl Alfgeir Oxbreeder had reluctantly agreed to accept Mother as a servant in his hall, but caring for Donner had brought expenses that had quickly put her in Alfgeir's debt. Before Donner's 5th birthday, he and Mother had both become thralls to the Oxbreeder farm, one step above slaves. No amount of hard work kept them fed and clothed without more debt, thanks to Donner's enormous appetite. Donner continued his grip on pouch and thong. It was unfair, but that was how the 9 ran the world. It didn't matter what a thrall thought. He told himself that over and over, trying to make himself believe it. I'm sorry, Karl Oxbreeder, he said at last. You'll have to pull it out, Alfgeir said. As the saying goes, the price of foolishness is hard work. I can't do it alone, sir, Donner pointed out. Norbert will have to help. Norbert's face grew red, and he drew back his fist again, but Alfgeir stepped between them. Let's just get that calf out. Alfgeir turned to Norbert. So how did it fall in, then? He had already asked that, and it was clear he was giving Norbert another chance to come clean. Donner looked sideways at the young man. At 18, Norbert was only 2 years older than Donner, and when they were kinderlings, Donner had followed Norbert around like an oversized puppy. They had played troll in the wood, Donner was always the troll, and fished in the brook and built a castle out of logs and stones. People called Donner Norbert's pet, and they chuckled indulgently. But as they grew, Norbert became less interested in games and more aware of Donner's status as a thrall and a troll. These days it was as if they had never been friends and were instead a breath away from a blood feud. Norbert ran his tongue around the inside of his cheek, and Donner held his breath. It would be a fine thing if Norbert, just this once, would be his friend again, like when they were boys. I told you, Norbert growled. It's Trollboy's fault. Alfgeir sighed. Donner could see that he knew the truth, but he wasn't going to side with a troll. All right, on your head be it, Trollboy, if the creature's injured. The calf bawled again, its voice barely audible above the ground. Alfgeir took up a coil of heavy rope. Climb on down. Me, sir? Donner said in surprise. I thought you wanted me to pull it up. I'm not going down there, Norbert scoffed. It's muck to the knees, and these boots are almost new. Donner didn't bother to protest. There was no point. Instead, he squatted at the edge of the well and lowered himself into darkness, where he hung by one hand for a moment with easy strength before he let go. The floor of the well and the bawling calf rushed up at him. Donner managed to twist and land beside the calf with a great splat in the mud at the bottom. Though his jaw came down across the calf's back, his teeth crashed together and he saw stars. You didn't hurt the calf, did you? Alfgeir demanded from above. No, Karl Oxbreeder. Donner spat out a mouthful of blood, then pushed himself upright in the cool darkness. The wild-eyed calf bawled, and the sound boomed against the earth and sides of the well. It was actually nicer down there, despite the mud. Donner felt more at ease when he was surrounded by earth or an enclosed space. He supposed it was his troll half speaking. The pain in his jaw faded somewhat. He scratched the calf's neck and ears. You're a pretty one, he murmured. Everything's fine now. We'll get you out. No need to worry. The calf calmed. It was covered in mud. Donner sniffed the air. The only way to clear cow manure out of a well was to let the water sit untouched for several months, and that would be disastrous, especially if Alfgeir took it into his head to add the time to dig in yet another well to Donner's bonding. But he smelled nothing. That was a small blessing, thanks be to the nine. He looked up. Even when it was full day above, the sky always looked velvet black from the bottom of a well. Donner had no idea why. He could even see stars. The fleck of brightness that was one half of Orko shone directly above him. The star that was Orko's other half had moved just into the well's horizon, ready to join with its opposite. Urko, the traitor Stein who had joined the 9 gods in Lumenheim, and had then been sliced in two by his brother Stein for his trouble. Now his right half lived in Lumenheim with the 9, and his left half lived in Glumenheim with the Stein, and each side thought the other half spied for them. Only once in every 100 years did they rejoin, and the 2 stars showed it in the sky. Where does Urko really live? Donner asked when Mother first told him that story. With the Stein or with the 9? The story doesn't say, she had replied. I suppose you have to decide for yourself. The knotted end of a rope hit him in the face. Let us know when you're ready, troll boy, Alfgeir called. With a sigh, Donner set to work tying the rope in a harness around the calf. It wasn't easy in the narrow, wet space. Mud squished up to Donner's shins, slowing him further. The calf struggled, and more than once Donner had to stop work to calm it. What's taking so long? Norbert shouted down at him. You're dawdling on purpose to get out of real work. Donner ground his teeth and kept at it. The knots had to be done just right. If they came undone, the calf might fall on Donner and injure itself. His hands, soaked in muddy water, grew cold, and the rope became stubborn beneath his fingers. The calf continued its restlessness. At last, however, Donner had it in a rough harness. Ready, he called, and tugged on the rope. It tightened, and the calf came free of the mud with a sucking sound. A surprised expression crossed its face as it rose toward the stars like a strange sacrifice. It reached the top, where Alfgeir and Norbert hauled it to safety. Donner waited a moment, and when nothing was forthcoming, he called up, Could I have the rope? Norbert poked his head over the edge. We're undoing these stupid knots you tied. Anyway, you're too heavy. Climb up yourself. The monster snarled inside him again. Donner clutched the pouch at his neck. His mother's soft voice always came back to him better when he did. Don't give in. Don't give them an excuse to hurt you. Don't let the monster out. Yes, mother, he whispered. He dug hands and feet into the sides of the well, his stony fingers biting into the stiff earth, and climbed toward the upper world. It was hard work. All his strength was in his arms and legs, but this used his wrists, and fiery aches burned in his hands by the time he reached the top. Gasping, he grabbed the rim of the well to haul himself up over the top. I'll teach the troll some respect, father. Norbert stamped on Donner's fingers. More pain lanced through Donner's hand. He let go of the yelp and landed heavily in the cold mud. Norbert, Alfgeir said mildly at the top, I don't want you abusing thralls this way. If you injure him, he won't be able to do his work. Sorry, father. Norbert didn't sound sorry in the least. I did make him get the calf out. Good work, that, Alfgeir said. Donner levered himself out of the mud, worked his jaw back and forth, and set himself to climb again. There was nothing else to do. When he finally pulled himself dripping out of darkness, the sunlight slashed his eyes and drilled through his skull. His hat was gone, lost below. He grunted and tried to shield himself with one arm, but the sun's rays thrust sharp pain straight through him. "Where's your hat?" Alfgeir tutted. "Honestly, Trollboy, you can't even keep track of the smallest thing. Here." He laid his own broad-brimmed hat on Donner's head, and the pain abated somewhat. "Thank you, Carl." "I'll add it to your bonding," Alfgeir said. "As the saying goes, a worther is worth his wages, and wages must be worth his work." Donner touched the brim of the hat. It was old and battered and too small for him, and he had the feeling Alfgeir would add the price of a brand new hat to his bonding. But he only said, "Yes, Carl Oxbreeder." "Go wash up," Alfgeir said, "and then I want you to run an errand." Donner blinked. An errand? This was unusual. Errands were choice, easy jobs that granted a chance to leave the farm for a bit. Donner was never chosen to run errands. He always did heavier, smelly work, like cutting stone or dragging trees or spreading manure on the fields. Yes, Carl, he said, letting himself feel a little excited. Maybe today wouldn't turn out to be so bad after all. He trotted across the farm toward the main well. Alfgeir's farm sprawled at the foothill bottoms of the Balsam Mountains, meaning no one lived above them, and there was plenty of free pasture in the hills for cows and sheep, while the Alfgeir family and thralls farmed the flatter land below. Because Alfgeir was wealthy, his long L-shaped thatched hall stood apart from the stables, unlike poorer farmers who attached animal housing to their homes for the added warmth. There was even a separate hall for the servants and thralls across a courtyard paved with mountain stones. Donner, however, lived in the stable, which was an enormous longhouse shaped like a giant log sunk into the ground. The building was less than 3 years old. The original had burned down 2 summers ago. Fortunately, Donner had managed to get most of the cattle out, and only 6 had died. This hadn't stopped Alfgeir from blaming Donner for the entire incident and adding the cost of the lost cows and a new stable to Donner's debts. It didn't matter to Alfgeir that the new stable was almost twice as large as the old, or that Donner had done the work of 5 men during the construction. Alfgeir said Donner's debt was for the full cost of a new stable. It seemed to Donner that his debt should have been for the cost of rebuilding the original, and Alfgeir should have shouldered the difference for the bigger one. But Donner kept quiet. He could have taken his case to the Earl. Even a thrall had rights. But then he thought of facing all those staring eyes in the public arena, and how likely was it that the Earl would rule in favor of a troll? So Donner had silently accepted the additional debt, and with it the burden of anger whenever he thought about the new stable walls. The farm's well was equipped with a windlass and an enormous bucket that only Donner could lift when it was full. He hauled it dripping from the depths and simply poured it over himself, repeating until the water ran clear. His ragged clothes were the only ones he owned, and he went barefoot even in winter, so he had nothing to change into. At least he would dry soon enough in the hurtful spring sunshine. Hunger rumbled in Donner's belly. He sighed. He was almost always hungry, and whenever he ate more than a grown man, Alfgeir added the difference to his bonding, which meant Donner had to do extra work to have it removed, which in turn made him hungrier. It was a little spiral he didn't know how to break. Perhaps today he could slip away during the errand and go fishing. A salmon, or even a trout, spit and roasted over a little fire, would go a long way in quelling the eternal emptiness inside him. A shrill whistle caught his attention. Alfgeir was waving to him from one of the paddocks near the stable. Donner clapped the ill-fit hat back on his head and lumbered over. A young bull, barely into adolescence, was tied in the paddock. "Take this animal to Orvandel the Fletcher," Alfgeir said. "He lives on the outskirts of Skyford, and I owe him a debt. If you hurry, you can make it to his house and back before dark." Donner eyed Alfgeir uneasily. A chance to go in the city was definitely a choice errand, something Alfgeir's sons would fight over. Why was Alfgeir sending Donner? It rang false. "Are you sure you don't want to send Norbert, Carl Oxbreeder?" he temporized. "Or Tager? They might—" "I didn't ask your opinion, Trollboy," Alfgeir said in a deceptively even tone. "I gave you an order." He turned on his heel and stalked away. Donner looked after him for a moment, then shrugged and lifted the handle on the gate. The bull lowed at him. On closer inspection, Donner realized it was not a bull, but a steer, newly castrated. The animal was brown and just came up to Donner's waist. Bones showed through skin, and Donner recognized it. The animal had been recently recovered from a winter illness. This was repayment for a debt? The steer bawled again, and Donner reached out with a big hand to scratch the places where its horns would one day grow. Its eyes closed contentedly. Oh well, this wasn't his decision, and Alfgeir had handed him a chance to escape the farm for a few hours on a fine spring day. Why question it? Donner took the steer's rope, and a few minutes later they were both on the rutted road that led toward the city of Skyford. The farm receded behind him, and the steer seemed content to follow along without being coaxed or hauled. Trees lined the road, forming boundaries between farms. Men and boys followed herds of cows around the field, and their voices mingled with bird song. Green grass had already filled the space between the ruts in the old road, and it was soft under Donner's feet. A good mood crept quietly over him, like a dog that had been kicked away but still wanted to please. Maybe one day Norbert would trip over his own feet and fall into a pile of manure, and Donner would be there to see it. Norbert would push himself upright, brown cow shit staining his beard, and everyone around him, including Donner, would enjoy a good long laugh. Then Donner could dump cold water from the well over him, and again, and again, and again. How would Norbert like that? Donner had fallen so deep into the fantasy that he was completely unprepared for the hooded figure that rose out of the undergrowth beside the road. The steer bellowed in alarm and tried to flee, but Donner tightened his grip on the rope and the steer jerked to a halt, almost twisting its head to the ground. Donner didn't budge. The figure's clothes were little more than rags and were bundled in awkward layers. It stepped out onto the road, a basket in one hand. A bit more gladness grew in Donner's heart, and he grinned a greeting. "Aisa," he said, "I haven't seen you in days. You scared my steer." "Apologies." Although the sun was quite warm, the low voice that drifted from the hood was muffled by multiple layers of scarf. "I was gathering greens, and I saw you coming down the road." "I'm taking the steer to Orvandel the Fletcher in Skyford," Donner told her proudly. "Alfgeir owes him a debt. Walk with me?" "For a bit." Aisa's words carried an accent, exotic and exciting, though she had never said where she came from. All Donner really knew about her was that she was a couple of years older than he was. She had been a slave to the elves in Alfheim for something like 2 years, and now she was a slave to a man named Farrak. Well, he knew that, and that seeing her always brought a little flutter to his heart, even though she never went anywhere without all her clothes wrapped around her. The most Donner had ever seen was a pair of brown eyes above a heavy scarf. It was enough. "How does Mistress Frida treat you?" Donner asked as they walked. "As she always has," Aisa replied, and changed the subject. "I came down to warn you." Donner halted so quickly that the steer bumped into him from behind. A little ball of tension turned cold in his stomach. "Warn me? Of what?" "News has reached the village that the farm of the Nios brothers was attacked last night. House and stable were destroyed, and both Oscar and Olaf are dead." Donner swallowed. The village behind lay between Alfgeir's farm and Skyford. Like Alfgeir, Oscar and Olaf Nios ran a farm that butted up against mountains and wilderness. Every year they talked about expanding, but they never did, and their talk had become a running joke in the village. "Why do you need to warn me?" he asked, though he had a feeling he knew the answer. "It is rumored," Aisa said slowly, "that someone found enormous tracks among the ruined buildings. Troll tracks." And that's chapter 1 of Iron Axe by Stephen Harper. Right? If you want to find out what happens next, check it out from the library or a bookstore. It's been great talking to everybody. I hope that you have a great summer.